Imagine being a soldier, stationed on the front lines of World War II, facing the constant threat of enemy airstrikes, the deafening roar of aircraft engines, the rush of bombs falling from the sky. It was a symphony of terror that haunted every soldier. But what if I told you that in the midst of all that chaos, soldiers came up with an ingenious and almost unbelievable tactic to fight back? What if I told you that music, yes, music, became a weapon in the war effort? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? But in the dark days of the war, soldiers in Britain and across Europe discovered that they could use music to lure enemy planes off course. A tactic so strange, so unexpected, it almost feels like something out of a spy novel. It all started with the need to outsmart the Luftwaffe, Germany's formidable air force. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, the Germans had perfected their night bombing raids, a devastating tactic that sent shockwaves through British defenses. As the night skies filled with the ominous hum of enemy planes, something had to change. In one of the most unconventional military operations of the war, soldiers began using radios to broadcast unusual sounds, hoping to mislead enemy pilots who were on a bombing run. The idea was simple yet brilliant. Create enough confusion and distortion in the German bombers' navigation systems that they would veer off course, unknowingly dropping their deadly payloads on the wrong targets. But how did it work? What kind of music, what kind of sounds would trick trained military pilots into making life-or-death mistakes? The answer was something soldiers never expected. Classical music, opera, and even the sound of children's choirs singing. The idea of using music as a weapon wasn't born out of desperation alone. It was the product of sheer ingenuity. The British knew they couldn't match the Luftwaffe in raw firepower, but they could exploit the enemy's over-reliance on technology. The Germans had sophisticated navigation systems for their bombers, relying heavily on radar and radio signals to guide them during night raids. But what if you could confuse those systems? What if you could jam their frequencies with sounds they weren't prepared for? That's exactly what soldiers did. In the dead of night, as German bombers cruised over England, soldiers would set up radios and start broadcasting a strange mixture of sounds. The soothing strings of a cello, the soaring notes of an opera singer, and even the innocent melodies of children's choirs. The idea was to overwhelm the bombers' guidance systems, causing them to misinterpret their location and drop their bombs miles away from their intended targets. One of the most effective tactics was to use live broadcasts. Musicians stationed in secret locations, playing classical pieces in the most discordant, chaotic ways. The Germans, trained to rely on precise calculations and mechanical systems, had no way to adjust for such an unpredictable force. As the music echoed through the night sky, it created a kind of sonic maze, disorienting the bombers and forcing them to make drastic course corrections. For the soldiers on the ground, it felt like a strange dance, an invisible war waged with melodies instead of gunfire. In some cases, it worked like a charm. German pilots, who relied on the clarity of their instruments to guide them, found themselves lost in the disorienting swell of music. Some bombers, thrown off course, dropped their bombs on farmland, while others veered away from the cities, sparing thousands of lives. But this tactic didn't come without its risks. The Germans were no fools. They quickly realized that something wasn't right when their carefully plotted bombing raids started missing their marks. The next question was, how would they respond to a tactic that had never been seen before in warfare? Would they adapt? Or would the Allies' strange music strategy prove to be a fleeting success, an odd footnote in the larger conflict? The German response to the music-based deception wasn't long in coming. Initially, they dismissed it as a nuisance, something the Allies had tried out of desperation. But when their raids started to miss their targets with startling frequency, the Luftwaffe knew it was time to adapt. They were facing an enemy who wasn't just using bombs and bullets, they were using sound itself as a weapon. The Germans quickly began experimenting with their own countermeasures. They upgraded their radar and bomb navigation systems, trying to filter out the chaotic noise broadcast by the Allies. They focused on improving their equipment to block out the foreign sounds, trying to reassert control over the skies that had been slipping from their grasp. But there was one problem. Technology could never fully replicate the human element. The real power behind the British tactic wasn't just the music itself, it was the unpredictability of the strategy. Even as the Germans upgraded their systems, they couldn't account for the human ingenuity behind this deceptive play. The unpredictability of live music, the use of real sounds rather than static signals, was something their radar simply couldn't manage. In fact, this led to a bizarre but brilliant back-and-forth game between the two sides. The Germans improved their technology, and the Allies responded with more creative broadcasts. The British soldiers, often with little more than a radio and an idea, pushed the boundaries of this sonic warfare, pulling from every musical genre imaginable to keep the Germans guessing. From Bach to Beethoven to more experimental broadcasts, nothing was off the table. The very nature of warfare had become fluid. Sound was no longer just a tool of morale or communication. It was a weapon, and it was deeply psychological. At the same time, these broadcasts did something even more powerful. They boosted morale on the home front. For the civilians living under the threat of nightly bombings, the sounds of music in the night skies were a reminder that the fight wasn't over. It gave people something to hold on to, a strange, almost poetic form of resistance that was entirely different from anything they'd seen before. It was proof that even in the darkest of times, humanity would find a way to push back against the tide. But despite the initial successes, the question remained. Would the Allies be able to maintain this unusual edge? Or would the Germans, with their relentless innovation, find a way to outmaneuver even this most unexpected of weapons? As the war raged on, the strange battle between music and technology continued to evolve, with both sides pushing their ingenuity to new limits. The British soldiers who had first used music to divert enemy bombers never anticipated the lasting impact their unorthodox strategy would have. What had begun as a desperate measure to confuse German bombers had morphed into a complex game of technological one-upmanship and a testament to human creativity under pressure. While the Germans worked tirelessly to upgrade their radar systems, the British also refined their broadcasts. They didn't just play any music, they crafted specific sonic landscapes, understanding that the power of music lay not only in the melody, but in the emotional dissonance it could create. They used harmonies that were jarring, sudden shifts in tempo, and arrangements that were chaotic, yet oddly compelling. These weren't just random noises. They were carefully chosen to unsettle the enemy, to create confusion in the hearts of seasoned pilots who had once felt in control. For those listening on the ground, it was a surreal experience. The sounds drifting through the night sky were like something from a dream, a strange, eerie soundtrack to the unfolding drama of the war. For the soldiers in the field, it became a badge of honor, a quiet, unspoken rebellion against the overwhelming might of the Axis powers. The idea that music, something so human, so innocent, could be turned into a tool of survival was both uplifting and tragic. It felt like the most unlikely weapon in the world, but it had become a symbol of resistance, of a people who refused to give in to fear. But as the Germans adapted and improved their systems, the tide began to turn. The technology gap started to narrow, and the British began to feel the pressure. In 1943, a new generation of German bombers, equipped with more advanced radar and jamming technology, began to reassert their dominance in the skies. The music strategy, while still effective, had to constantly evolve to stay ahead of the new technology. And that's when the Allies realized that the music couldn't just be a tool of deception anymore. It had to be part of a broader, more complex strategy. This was the turning point. The Allies began to combine their music broadcasts with more traditional countermeasures, smokescreens, new radar systems, and even tactical deception with decoy targets. But the music remained a central component. It wasn't just a distraction, it became a symbol of how the war was fought. It was a reminder that no matter how sophisticated the technology, there was something unpredictable and distinctly human that couldn't be controlled. And then, in 1944, as the war reached its climax, the Allies began to break through. The D-Day landings marked a shift in momentum, and the sound of the bombs dropped from the German bombers became a background noise to the growing triumph of the Allied forces. As German morale waned and their strategic failures mounted, the need for musical deception diminished. The war wasn't won by music alone, but it was a part of the broader strategy that helped break the enemy's grip on the skies. In the aftermath of the war, the story of music's role in the conflict faded into the background, overshadowed by the more tangible victories. But the soldiers who used music as a weapon knew the truth. It had been more than just a tactic. It had been a way to fight back against the overwhelming darkness, a reminder that even in the face of terror, creativity, and the human spirit could still find a way to rise above. It's a strange, almost poetic irony that in a war defined by violence and technology, it was something as simple as a song, an unexpected blend of melody and sound, that played its part in altering the course of history. The power of music to confuse, to mislead, and to protect wasn't just a war tactic. It was a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable odds. The soldiers, musicians, and technicians who worked together in this most unusual of campaigns proved that even in the deadliest of conflicts, there's always room for a little bit of humanity to break through.